at the top of the economy and letting it trickle down. So I think we're moving away from the age of Reagan into a different age. If American democracy can survive through the next election periods and the tumult of this, and I think it will, this will be the greatest country in the 21st century, just like it was in the 20th.
First of all, I'm thrilled to be here. I will admit that some of you will struggle with my accent. I talk to Con Harvard Yard every once in a while. And yes, I'm from New England. Many of the, I'm going to say, the roots of our democracy actually came from New England. And I grew up in the town of Holbrook, Holbrook, which at the time of the founding of our great nation was part of Braintree, which was the home of John Adams and John Quincy Adams and John Hancock and a lot of people that fought to give us the country that we have. I grew up in a family that was working class but well educated and passionate about democracy. I was blessed to have a grandmother who had a huge influence on my life, who was very well educated from the time. She was born in 1894, and she went to college, and she was a school teacher, a very prominent school teacher, but she was also a militant suffragette who fought for women to get the right to vote. And I remember a picture hanging in her dining room of women wearing white dresses, marching down Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, fighting for the right to vote. And she was a very proud suffragette. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother because she lived right across the street from me, not over the river and through the woods, but across the street. And whenever I was not doing my homework or doing something else that I shouldn't be doing, I was sent to Grandma's house. And she had a tremendous influence on me, and it started with this. The most important word in our Constitution is the very first word. We. It's our government. When I was your age, we didn't apply to me. In 1920, it did. I want you to know that you should be part of we. And the Constitution is an invitation, because the we doesn't say you must do this or you will do this. It invites you to do that or something else. It invites you to be part of our government. It invites you to register to vote. It invites you to vote. It invites you to run for office. It invites you to serve as a civilian in government. She said, accept the invitation. Accept the invitation, no matter what your calling in life. And I did as a very young boy. I loved the politics of Holbrook, Massachusetts, the school committee, the planning board, the selectmen. You don't even know what they are. You know, like city councilors or mayors. And I volunteered on campaigns, passed out bumper stickers, couldn't wait to vote, loved election day. I then went to college, and I went on a Navy ROTC scholarship to the University of South Carolina. They couldn't understand me at all. And I trained to become an engineer. I didn't realize if you were an engineer and a politician, you're an oxymoron. And I don't know whether I was the oxy or the moron. Because I was very active in politics, and I was very active as an engineer. Sometimes being an engineer was good in politics because it gave you structure and logic, and you realize you design a building from the top down, but you build it from the bottom up. And politics sometimes just says, give me the building. And and they don't have a structure to it, and they don't know where it will stand or how it will stand, or how long it will stand, and whether it will live up to the expectations. But my grandmother said, be part of the we, accept the invitation. I came to realize that the invitation to be part of government is an open invitation. It's not an invitation that is sent to you. It's an invitation that sits there for you to accept. So you don't get to say, don't send the invitation to my neighbor because he's crazy. No, they can be invited because they're crazy. And it's okay. And my grandmother, when we got at the dining room table as a family to eat, she was very strong in her faith. We had to offer a blessing. But we could not pick up an eating utensil in front of us until we responded to what my grandmother would say would tell me something from the newspaper today. And it could be anything. I remember as 14, 15 years old, it was always about the Celtics or the Bruins or the Red Sox. But inevitably, every conversation turned around something to do with what was happening in the town of Holbrook, the school committee, the planning board, the selectmen, the snow plowing, the potholes. What's going on Beacon Hill? That's where the Massachusetts governor presides, and the House of Representatives, and the state senate. What's going on Capitol Hill? What's going on at the White House? And every dinner conversation ended up being an argument about something in politics, usually about the school committee. And my grandmother said, this is great, but there's one problem that you have. You tend to agree too quickly. Where is the other side of that debate? Why aren't you listening to him or her? Where is their view? And she would make sure that we were introduced to different factions. And I love the story of the factions. As an engineer, I also like fractions. And sometimes the factions need to be more like fractions and be smaller. But they're important, they're part of the democracy. So, number one, I'm saying, please, respect that first word in the Constitution, embrace it, accept the invitation, and get involved. But also recognize that the Constitution has a lot of words in it that invite the fractions. Freedom of speech. Freedom to make a choice. We are gifted, well, first of all, God made an unbelievable decision when He created us, and He said, I'm giving you free choice. And God was absolute. He could have not given us free choice, and we would all be perfect. But God said, I love you so much, I'm going to give you choice. And so people, I don't know where people come up with their choices sometimes, but they're their choices. And I'm really glad that I don't have to impose my choice on anyone. But I feel comfortable inviting my choice to be your choice too. So I view this march through democracy, and we are really marching through democracy. We are still a very young country. We're a young country. And growing up in New England, where there's lots of talk about, what it's like to be an American, what it's like to beat up on the British when they jacked up the tax on tea, and people dressed as Native Americans who went down and threw the tea in Boston Harbor. Or when they dragged cannons down from Ticonderoga to Boston to say, we're going to drive you out of here, Great Britain, and they did. There's a lot of history where I live. There's a lot of history in Ohio. But all of that history is polished by the we in our government, the people. And so, we're supposed to be disagreeing, and we will, and we can, and we should sometimes. But you know what? The rug of American politics, sometimes it has more fringe than rug. Usually it has more rug than fringe. And that thread that's on the left is the same thread coming out on the right. But we sometimes get stuck on the fringe. And we demand that there be no other fringe. If there's no other fringe, you're not part of the rug. And I say, take a step onto the fringe every once in a while, but be grounded on the rug. And recognize that there's more common ground than you want to admit. This last election was one where people were searching to prove that you were standing on a fringe of the rug. The campaign was all about that. The far left and the far right. Be pure, stand only on this fringe. Be pure, stand only on that fringe. And guess what? There are a lot of us who are saying, I like the rug. It's informed by the fringe from the left. It's informed by the fringe on the right. Make me smart and give me a chance to stand on the rug with other people who have answered the invitation to be part of our solutions. Guess what? Congress has now discovered that it's more exciting to have fringe in Congress than it ever used to be. So there now are so many caucuses, I call them cockeye. And I would like to see us, the we, say, please acknowledge the fringe, but try to stand on the rug. It's a nice place to stand, and you don't trip as much if you're standing on the rug as many times as you trip when you're only standing on the fringe. And when you fall over on the fringe, bad things happen. So I'm inviting you to be a very proud part of we in our country. For two reasons. Number one, our country needs you. We need your wisdom. We need your cynicism. We need your enthusiasm. We need your passion. We need your love. Be part of the we. We also need to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we are pretty darn good and that they should want to be like we are. The National Endowment for Democracy was started by President Ronald Reagan after a speech that he gave at Westminster in London, where he called for the democracies of the world to plant seeds of democracy in places where people are disenfranchised, whether they're oligarchs or autocrats, with communism, with some big brother in charge. Ronald Reagan said, democracies have a responsibility to plant seeds. And that's what the National Endowment for Democracy was doing. But you can only plant the seeds if you know that they would be fertilized, because people are looking to us to see what we do. So I want to polish our democracy because I want the world again to see what Ronald Reagan provided. That shining city on a hill is our great democracy. And we're not selfish in our democracy. We don't want to be the only democracy in the world. No, we want everyone to be in a democracy. We want everyone to have a constitution that starts with the word we. So that's what's driven me to be part of politics. Again, why is an engineer involved? There are very few engineers in politics. It's frustrating to those of us who are engineers and say, there's logic here. And it can work. So now Congress is obligating themselves to demonstrate to we that they can work for us. And boy, it was painful, riveting to watch the great debate that included roll call after roll call after roll call after roll call to find a Speaker of the House. And the one thing that that exercise did do was cause people to talk to each other on the floor of the House. And I was impressed. I actually was looking to see who is talking to whom. And then I'm thinking of this strategy, you know, I'm saying, if I were there, this is what, I would go talk to her or him or them. And then I started to think, who is talking to we? And I really couldn't just define it. But I'm correct in saying tribes knew who people were talking to. We've become a very tribal democracy. Tribal democracy was not something that our founding fathers envisioned. We weren't supposed to be separate tribes. We could be very parochially separate states, but those are laboratories of democracy. So I've overstayed my welcoming comments, but I want to tell you that I'm going to fight like heck to make sure we is all-inclusive as a word and defines our democracy, because I want the rest of the world to have what we have. With that, I look forward to your questions.
Okay, I think for recording purposes and just being able to hear purposes, if you have a question, please go to one of the two microphones. And don't be shy, and you'll need to turn them on. We have them off at the moment. Just walk right up to them and turn them on. In the meantime, while you're thinking of your first question, if I can take the prerogative and ask a question that's really been on my mind for the last few days. And it's a nice segue. You know, General Clark was here back in November, I think it was, to talk about the war in Ukraine. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is domestic policy, and that's correct. But domestic policy and the Ukraine war have gotten very lined up in the last few days as we hear more people coming out, I think primarily on the Republican side, arguing that we need to change the level of support or diminish our support, pull back from supporting as much the Ukrainian government against Russia. And I'd be very interested to hear each of your gentlemen's perspective on that. And then again, whoever wants to take the next question, please just go to the line.
Yeah, well, so I think when you look at politics, I go back to what I was taught by a friend of mine who was a Texas A&M graduate, and they always say about Aggies, they say, you can always tell an Aggie, but you can't tell him much. But Chet Edwards was one of those great Democratic congressmen that I know you knew him, and he worked across the aisle and so forth. But he told me, after I'd run for president, too late, but he told me, he said, there's 3 rules in politics. Define yourself, define your opponent, and respond quickly to attacks. So I think what you're seeing bubbling out from the Republican Party right now is some people who want to ask, can I define myself this way? I mean, I'm not going to go support Joe Biden if I don't have to. And isn't there another way of looking at this? And so it's come out in a couple of different forms. One is, we think these Ukrainians, there's too much waste and corruption in that, and we're going to check that out. And it's come out also in Ron DeSantis as a putative presidential candidate saying that he wouldn't support Ukraine unreservedly the way that some people have. So I think it's a search to see what kind of public resonance they can get from identifying themselves that way. And that's the way I see it, because when you look at the polls for the American people, it's astonishing, really. It's still pretty solid at around 70% of the American people support Ukraine. And you know, to get 70% of the people supporting anything is pretty astonishing. 70% of the American people don't support the Beatles as the greatest rock band. I mean, 70% of the people don't like the Boston Red Sox. I mean, it's just, you know, it's the way democracies work. I don't know if we've ever had an election where 70% of the people voted for one candidate for president. I mean, it's just, that's the way it is. So this is pretty astonishing level of support. Now, the thing about it is that people get bored in democracies. And so if they keep hearing the same news, they have to, okay, the Russians are bad, the Russians are torturing, okay, I heard that last week. What's J-Lo up to now? And didn't she have a problem? Was she still with Ben Affleck? And Ben Affleck, yeah. Didn't he team up with that other guy from Good Will Hunting? And isn't that, there's a new movie out?
A Boston movie.
A Boston, yeah. Pop, 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 pop. This is Americans snacking on information. And so there is probably a dwindling of the intensity that was the shock that went through the American people on the 24th of February, 2022, when Russia attacked. But, you know, I think that for the near term, there's solid support for Ukraine from the leaders of both parties.
It's appropriate that we're discussing this week, because this week, 20 years ago, a decision was made to go to war in Iraq. Controversial at the time, with tremendous support from the American people, by the way, and from Congress. There was overwhelming support from Congress, both the House and the Senate, but we went to war. It became controversial later as the war went on. But I happen to feel it's very important for America to stand with the democracy of Ukraine. And the current leader of Ukraine has become maybe the best known public figure outside of America when it comes to defining democracy and standing up for democracy. I think we have an obligation to help Ukraine. Now, I do think it's appropriate that we give definition to help. What does it mean? There's moral support, there's financial support, there are weapons support, there's institutional support, there's aid, and I know a lot of agencies that are helping, non-government agencies that are helping people in Ukraine right now. That's important. But I do not feel it's appropriate for us to abandon a democracy. I think we should stand strongly with Ukraine. And I am kind of a hawk on presenting ourselves to our potential enemies. I don't think that we should be afraid to use language that says enough's enough. Or we're going to take you at your word and we're not going to let you do it. And the consequence is real. Unfortunately, America's voice saying that doesn't always have the traction that we as Americans feel it should have. We put red lines in Syria under President Obama, and those red lines were crossed with no consequence. We put red lines in Afghanistan in the withdrawal. The red lines were crossed and there was no consequence. We put red lines around how we're going to treat Turkey. And they were crossed and there was no consequence. So I worry about our rhetoric as perceived by other nations, and more significantly, people who aspire to be like us as a democracy, to say, will they be there for us? If we give our word, if we protect the Afghans who supported us during a very difficult time, and then we abandon them, that is a cancer that spreads against America and against democracy. So I'm someone who feels, be careful with the words you use. The president's words are the most precious words in our democracy. Presidents should be very careful with the words they use. And people who represent our nation should be careful with the words that they use. If you put a red line down, well, maybe I should go back to my grandmother. She's had two things to me that really have haunted me and continue to convict me every day. Taste your words before you spit them out. Too many people today do not taste their words before they spit them out. The second thing she said to me, and this one took a while for me to acknowledge, do not leave the room until you go out the door. I know why she told that to me, because I was a know-it-all 15-year-old. I'd come in home and tell her what truth was like, or what perfection was, or what the world should be, and be pretty full of myself and talk about what happened in the class. And my grandmother would say, you left the room before you went out the door. You probably came in and you told everybody what you thought, and then you doodled or you daydreamed. And you gave something to them, and you took something when you came out. You left a lot behind, and you came out with less than you had when you went in. Do not leave the room until you go out the door. Listen to everybody. Pay attention. I'm going to tell you one story that I shouldn't tell you, because it's going to be on the internet, I'm sure. Very first week of the George W. Bush presidency, Condoleezza Rice was the head of the National Security Council. And she convened a meeting in the Roosevelt Room of the West Wing of the White House. And she invited all of the principal members of the National Security team, except for the president. But it was the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Homeland Security. There was the team. And Dr. Rice gave a wonderful presentation of how she was going to organize the interaction with the National Security Council. It was a very good meeting. And then she opened it up for questions. And people were making comments and offering suggestions. And Secretary Rumsfeld was way down the other end of the table. And I happened to be sitting beside Condi Rice and the Vice President. And candidly, Secretary Rumsfeld, I think, had left the room a few times without going out the door. And when it came for him to comment, and he was the last one invited to comment, his commentary was disconnected from the conversation that had been taking place at the table. And it was a little awkward. It was actually embarrassing. And I could tell Condi was a little taken aback by it, and even the Vice President was a little taken aback by it. And I said, Mr. Secretary, I think you left the room before you went out the door. Could you tell us, could you remind us of what Condi said when she started the meeting? And he couldn't. Dick Cheney said, you stepped in it. But I think that admonition is valuable, especially in today's time. If we taste our words before we spit them out, I guarantee we will not be stuck on stupid as long as we go. If we listen to everyone as they express themselves, even when we disagree, the chances are we will learn something, or find common ground, or find a reason to say, let's solve the problem rather than just talk about it. So, a long answer to the question, but I do think it's important for us to keep our word as a nation. We did a really good job in Vietnam under difficult circumstances. If you go back and look at Vietnam, when we pulled out of Vietnam, we actually worked very hard to bring all of the people to America that we said we would bring to America. And I think that it was something like